what Cypriot politicians need to do, first of all, is look after Cyprus. This is obvious. But look after Cyprus in a context of Europe and in a context of the world. And there's one other concept that I find very, very useful. And it's actually embodied in the European idea. It came from the Catholic Church originally, but it's called subsidiarity. And the idea of subsidiarity is, let's get real. We need governments at all levels. We need a global government, that's the UN. We need a regional government, that's the European Union. We need a national government, that is the government of Cyprus. We need a local government, that is the Nicosia City Hall where we are right now. You have governments at all levels. The idea of subsidiarity is put the governance at the lowest level you can, where that level of government can actually do what it needs to do. So we don't want the UN running the local school system. We want the local government running the local school system, or running the local clinic, or keeping the potholes cleared up on the city streets, or making the sidewalks passable, or making the parks beautiful. That's not the job of the UN. On the other hand, the city of Nicosia cannot solve the global climate crisis. It's impossible. If you made your
You
own...
underestimate Nicosia.
I don't want to estimate you at all. And I will tell you one thing. If the weather that we had was what we create just over our own heads, the climate crisis would be solved. Each place would warm to the extent that they want to warm. They would stop. They would take care. You would control your own climate. If it was getting too dry, you would turn the dials. Maybe we should have some more solar power, a little bit less gas power, and so forth. The problem is, as you know, the climate is driven by the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And when you put some CO2 into the atmosphere by driving your car that is a petrol engine, burning the petrol, putting the CO2 up, in 30 days, that CO2 can be anywhere in the atmosphere. The scientists call it uniform mixing. So the atmosphere doesn't care where the CO2 comes from. It all gets mixed to create the global climate. That means we cannot solve the global climate crisis except with global government, dare I say. That's a term that's evil in the United States context. Global government, Mr. Sachs? Are you a globalist? Of course I'm not a globalist in this awful sense that people think. I don't want the UN telling you what to do, how to live, what to eat, and so forth. But when it comes to saving the Earth's climate, I want a global, effective arrangement.
And we might need this with AI as well.
And we're going to need this. We need it with nuclear weapons, ladies and gentlemen. We need it with all powerful technologies. I'll tell you a sad truth, also a little surprising. And I have to admit, what I'm about to tell you is only 99% sure. But my view, based on very extensive work over the last 4.5 years, is that COVID came from the University of North Carolina, which is the leading researcher on beta coronaviruses, working with the U.S. government on a set of grant proposals that identified putting in the viral change that created SARS-CoV-2. It's a grim truth. It's ugly. It's been hidden from view. The reason I mention it in this context is we don't have any global governance that is effective right now to control the manipulation of dangerous pathogens like the manipulation that created the pandemic. And when it happened, and officially it took 7 million deaths, but probably if you count all of the deaths associated with COVID, it was probably closer to 20 million deaths. Even when that happens, it's never properly investigated. It's covered up. It's hidden from view.
This is a big claim. It's the first time that I hear it. Can you tell us a bit more about this? How and why? And
yeah, and I didn't want to divert except to say we need global government to keep us alive. Don't underestimate how much things can get screwed up by dangerous technologies that are not under proper control. Just a word about this because, honestly, I've spent I don't know how much time over the last 4.5 years with learning from others because I'm not a scientist. I'm a pretty assiduous researcher, but I depend on what the scientists have helped me to understand. But basically, COVID is caused by a virus. The virus is called SARS-CoV-2. SARS was the original disease, and SARS-CoV-2 is the scientific name of the virus that causes COVID-19 disease. When you look at the virus, there's something very odd about it. For two major reasons, it looks like it's manipulated in the laboratory. Of course, that's not absolutely ironclad to prove. Ironclad would be to get the emails and the lab experiments and the lab notebooks and so forth, which we don't have because they remain hidden from view. But you can tell from the genetic signature a lot. And there are two main parts of the virus that show, my God, someone was tampering with this kind of virus. One of them is 4 amino acids. And for those of you who remember your biochemistry, that means 12 nucleotides. Each 3 codes for 1 amino acid. There are 4 amino acids that are inserted in this virus that don't appear anywhere else in nature in this family of viruses, which is a bat family. And in the research proposals for many years, scientists at University of North Carolina and some other places had the idea of putting in that sequence to do certain experiments because they knew that if that sequence is put in, it's called a furin cleavage site, it makes the virus most likely much more transmissible and dangerous to people. So they were studying that. It was never seen in nature, but the idea was, maybe if we put it in, it becomes very dangerous. And you can find the documents explaining that's the experiment we want to do. Now, there's a lot more that can be said, but the point is, because of people who leaked information, because of Freedom of Information Act, because of people who talked, we now have a very good record of what most likely happened. Not for sure, but most likely. And what most likely happened is that our government, the U.S. government, funded research to put this furin cleavage site into this virus with the strange idea, ladies and gentlemen, of creating a vaccine for bats. What they wanted to do was to have something that could be put into the air in caves in Southeast Asia that the bats would inhale and then make the bats immune to new infections by these beta coronaviruses. It sounds wild, and it is. But the idea was that American soldiers fight in Southeast Asia, and they could get sick from these viruses transmitted by the bats. So we should create vaccines against bats. Honestly, only the U.S. Department of Defense could come up with this. Honestly, I'm telling you. But it's not atypical. It's really how the government of the United States operates. So they did these experiments, most likely, again, I'm putting it at 99%. And then they tested it on the bats that the U.S. has in captivity in the government laboratory in Montana. And the virus worked. It was transmitted in the bats. But there was only one problem, ladies and gentlemen. The kind of bat that the U.S. has in captivity isn't the kind of bat in Southeast Asia. In Montana, they're called Egyptian fruit bats. But the bats in Southeast Asia are called horseshoe bats, or Rhinophilus sinicus bats in particular in Yunnan province, China. Who has those bats? Who do you think has those bats in captivity?
China.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology. So how about taking this test virus and testing it in the bats in Wuhan Institute of Virology? You just send it by mail. Oops! What happened? Oh, did I stick myself? Did I breathe something I shouldn't have breathed? There was a lab accident in Wuhan. And the next thing we know, several years later, 20 million dead.
So you think the United States did it to harm China?
No. The United States did it most likely for the very reason it says in a proposal you can find online, by the way, if you're really interested in this. It's called the Diffuse Proposal, DEFUSE, submitted to something called DARPA, which is the Defense Department Advanced Research Program. And you can find it online, and it explains what did they want to do. They wanted to make it safe for American fighters in Southeast Asia, not by harming China, but by protecting bats from infection. Okay, honestly, pretty weird. But when you're rich, you can do a lot of weird things. And that's one of the weird things the United States did. And incidentally, when the virus appeared, the scientists said, oh shit, this looks not natural. Something bad probably happened. And they said that on February 1st, 2020, in a private phone call of the top scientists that was then released by a Freedom of Information Act. And you know what? 4 days later, those same scientists wrote the first draft of a paper saying, this came from nature. That's called a cover-up. So this was the next step of this. Europe isn't working either in a very effective way. Now, we have a lot to talk about on that because views will differ on that. But my view is you need more Europe, not less Europe. This is very paradoxical for people. If it's not working, why do you want more, you idiot? If it's not working, you should have less. Okay, perfectly understandable. I don't want more for the sake of more. I want more because you need something more, in my opinion. The reason things don't function in part is that when everything is unanimity of 27, it doesn't work. When the budget at the union level is 1% of the gross domestic product of Europe, but the budget at the national level is 40%. So there's just one tiny bit at the union level and 40% at the national level. To my mind, that's a bit doomed to fail. My view is that Europe has fallen behind technologically, which is really surprising because it's 27. Europe has all the technology, all the leaders, all the institutions, all the universities, all the scientists that you need. But the United States has a continental market. China has a continental market. When we look for IT or AI, we got the whole market. What Europe has, as you know, it's the cliche, but you don't have the market, you've got regulation. Okay, so you don't have any AI champions right now. You don't have any electric vehicle champions right now. This was a huge mistake of the German auto industry that's hurting all of Europe right now. Europe adopted a European Green Deal. What is the European plan to implement the Green Deal? There isn't one. The Green Deal is goals that then went to 27 independent countries. No overall plan. If I say to a leading business in Europe, a big company, what's the infrastructure plan? They laugh at me. Jeff, don't you know anything? Of course there's no European plan. You can't even decide to connect the grids together properly except in a 10-year convulsion that is very difficult politically. Because really it's not a union that's as effective as it needs to be, in my opinion. So more of a bad thing is not a better thing. This is true. But what I'm saying is more effective in a world of giants where you have Russia on one side, you have the U.S. on the other side. And by the way, the U.S. is more likely to invade the EU than Russia is. Because Russia has denied that it's going to do it, but the United States has said repeatedly it's going to do it. I'm not joking. When the United States, our president says Greenland is going to be part of the United States, don't think it's a joke. It's incredibly vulgar, but it's not a joke. So you have real issues, actually. And that, from my mind, requires a kind of unity to think through the technology, the infrastructure, the role of AI in society, which is quite fundamental. Why is the world's leading lithography chip manufacturer, which of course is the Dutch company ASML, why is it governed by the United States, not by Europe? Pretty amazing. Who tells ASML what to do? You think the Netherlands government does? No. You think Brussels does? No. Of course it's the United States of America. That's a mistake. And so this, to my mind, is why you need more unity. By the way, you can disagree, but I'm talking right now.
It's okay. It's okay. We
No, I know. I'm just saying it's fine.
Okay, so
maybe I'll step back and say just a word about the United States, which is also in its own kind of crisis right now, and related to what you've asked me, because obviously we have a kind of broken constitution also, but actually we have at least a government that has functioned most of the time over the last couple hundred years. And the history of the United States is relevant for Europe in a way that I think is very important. And so if you give me just a minute to explain why. Like Cyprus, Britain, the United States, of course, was a British colony. And it got pretty sick and tired of being a British colony or British colonies by the mid-1770s. And in 1776, 13 independent colonies got together, drafted a Declaration of Independence with the great phrasing of Thomas Jefferson, and declared their independence. And the French came to the rescue of these 13 colonies, and the French basically defeated the British in 1778-79, and Britain said, okay, we're done with this in 1781, and went home. And when Britain went home, there were 13 separate countries, not a United States of America, but 13 separate countries, something like 27 European countries. They were a loose confederation, something like the Treaty of Lisbon, by the way, not more. There was no foreign policy, there was no central government, there was no central tax authority, there was no ability to do anything really as a group other than by unanimity. And that was called the Articles of Confederation. It looks not so far from the European Union model, in fact. And in the 1780s, it didn't work, not surprisingly, because now there were 13 independent countries. They couldn't agree on anything. They couldn't raise taxes to pay off the debts from the war that had just taken place. The Spanish were pushing them hard and trying to block them in the port at New Orleans. The British were pushing hard against these new tiny independent states and so forth. And 6 years after independence, they got together and said, this is not working. Actually, one really clever guy wangled the rest of them to a meeting in Philadelphia. And it would be like somebody in Europe saying, we need to rethink the Treaty of Lisbon. So James Madison, who was a Virginia politician and landowner, got the rest to send delegates to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And they kind of took off from there and wrote a constitution to create a real federal government. And interestingly, they cheated a little bit, not surprisingly, as politicians need to do, because under the Articles of Confederation, you could only amend the Articles of Confederation if you had unanimity. All 13 would have to agree. But this convention was a revolutionary convention. So they said if 9 out of the 13 agree, it applies. In other words, they changed the rules midway. They drafted the Constitution. Eventually, all 13 ratified it, even the tiniest ones like Rhode Island, the Cyprus of North America, if you want to put it that way, because it was a tiny colony compared to some of the bigger colonies. And they were worried, why should we have a federal government? My God, we're so tiny. But they were given certain prerogatives. For example, 2 senators, just like the 2 senators of Virginia, just like the 2 senators of Pennsylvania. In the lower house, it was by proportional size of population. But in the upper house, as it is till today, every state, big or small, gets 2 votes. But the point for me that's relevant is these independent countries in 1787 figured out something interesting. Like Europe, we better give up some of our sovereignty so that we can negotiate with the Spanish, we can face the British, we can collect taxes inside, we can build infrastructure. They had the idea, if we're 13, it isn't going to work. And they use the expression e pluribus unum. Out of many comes one. And they made a federal government for the first time. Pretty clever. By the way, the Constitution's not working very well right now. That's another very interesting matter because systems get corrupted over time. So the U.S. government's a very corrupt system now. I mean money. Campaign contributions and lobbying and so forth. So it's broken in some ways. But still, the idea that you think, what do we need for our time? How do we get organized? How do we set the rules that really make sense is good political thinking. And you understand that political institutions need to change over time. I'm in favor of a UN convention like the Philadelphia Convention. So in 1787, 13 independent countries said we better create an effective government. I want the 193 UN member states to do the same thing because we have a charter from 1945 which defines how the UN works, and it's not working right now. It's not keeping the peace. It's not playing its effective role. It's broke. It has no money. It's a little bit like the Articles of Confederation. When you come to Europe, that I can answer easily. Yes, it's possible. It's possible because of a simple fact. Conflicts are lose-lose propositions. Wars are not win-lose propositions. They're lose-lose propositions. When this island is divided, the Turkish Cypriots lose, the Greek Cypriots lose, Turkey loses, Europe loses, the world loses. Everybody loses. There's nothing won by having a wall in between two populations. That's a losing situation. So when you have a situation that is lose-lose, it is true that there can be a win-win. What is hard in life is win-lose situations, when somebody's taking something from somebody else. That's hard. And when you're in direct conflict over a resource, that can create, obviously, generally, I should put it actually a little bit more carefully. Most conflicts over resources actually are lose-lose because both sides clash, both sides lose, nobody wins out of the conflict. And that, I think, most accurately reflects the situation here, and it reflects the situation in Ukraine, and it reflects the situation in most places in the world. We don't get to the win-win outcomes for actually lots of obviously very complicated reasons because of fundamental differences of understanding of the situation, because of beliefs by one side that they can defeat the other side, that usually is a absolutely erroneous idea, but arrogance plays a huge role in the failure to reach solutions. Politicians often stand in the way because sometimes it's the case that the populations on both sides of a conflict say we want this to end, but a particular politician or small clique is so invested in the fighting that they know that their lives or their careers or their politics comes to an end if they go along with the interests of their own public. I believe that, and this is a complicated subject, we can talk about it, and what I'm going to say will annoy many people probably, but I think Zelensky is like that, by the way, because I believe that the big interest of the Ukrainian people and the big desire of the Ukrainian people is to end this war now. But yeah, it would be the end of Zelensky's time as president, certainly, if that were the case. And so I believe that this becomes a very personalized issue. One of the reasons why an area where I agree with Trump, most of the time I don't, but an area where I do agree with him is what he's doing to try to end the war in Ukraine is very simple for him. He says, this isn't my war, this is Biden's war. I don't want to have to live with that burden around my neck. And Biden would not change his position no matter how much the facts on the ground proved all his suppositions wrong, because these individual politicians don't like to change even when the broad publics want something different. So you asked me the question, is there a solution? I would define a solution as being an outcome that is better for both sides than the current outcome. Does that exist? I'm sure that it exists, because everyone's paying a price right now. No doubt, both sides are paying a price right now compared to what could be. So that means, in my opinion, that there is a solution. If I knew more, I would tell you exactly what it is. But I would tell you that in principle, in most conflicts in the world, they are driven by either completely erroneous beliefs, so beliefs of grandeur or beliefs of victory that are unjustified, or they're driven by politicians that don't represent the interests of the populations that ostensibly they are leading. And this, I think, is a pretty much true of conflicts throughout the ages.
I'm going to ask you a bit more. I'm not satisfied with your answer.
Okay, we're just getting started.
Yes. I'm going to bring a lot more pragmatic perspective to the conversation. For example, I'm a member of the European Parliament. We have rules, regulations, and all this stuff that we vote. So my role is to put, or Cyprus' role is to put pressure on Turkey with sanctions, with all this stuff. Like, how we should try to put pressure on Turkey to solve this? Should we try to work with Turkey in stuff in order to solve this? What should be our stand, kind of? It's a tough position to be.
No, I generally believe in one basic point, that if you are stuck in a situation where you can envision a win for both sides compared to the status quo, that the way out of that is some kind of negotiation or dialogue, not pressure. As a general matter, it's a basic economic idea. We call it Pareto improvement, from an Italian sociologist at the beginning of the 20th century named Vilfredo Pareto. The idea of a Pareto improvement is to move from the status quo to a situation that is better for both. So that's what I would search for. I would search for a movement from the current frozen conflict to something that is better for both sides. Then I'd ask the question, well, why not? What stops this? What is it that is holding this back? Is this some politicians on both sides or on one side? Is this Turkey on one side? Is this some other set of interests? But if it's a win-win proposition, why can't we get there? If you say, no, look, this is unfair, this has really hurt us, we don't accept any of this, so we're looking for a win-lose, we win, the other side loses because they're unfair, I don't know how to help. That's your business. But if you believe, as I would, that there's a way to make a win-win, then there are a lot of principles of how to move from the status quo to a win-win. Trump, by the way, thinks that the way you do it is that you punch your adversary in the nose first. You threaten them with more sanctions. You say, if we don't agree in a week, I'm going to destroy you. And then you sit down to talk. Maybe that's how you do it in New York real estate. I don't believe that that's the right way to do such a thing. I believe that you can have two different ways to do this. One is that you find a mediator, and you have someone help to mediate. And you go back and forth, and the mediator comes to your side and says, so what is it? And then they go to the other side and go back and forth. And if they're good mediators, they say, I'm beginning to discern a win-win. Here's some ideas. And you see whether you can move forward. The other way is to negotiate directly. I generally believe in negotiation directly. To my mind, negotiation is low cost and often surprisingly high outcomes. And one of the reasons is that, again, you'll say I'm simple-minded, maybe I am, but when you negotiate, if you treat the other side with respect, that goes a huge way, actually, in reaching an agreement. You may not like them, but if you're a good negotiator, you will treat them with respect, with dignity, you'll listen, and maybe actually really listen and learn because, oh, I didn't know that, or that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I never thought about the problem in those terms. And that, even experimentally, ladies and gentlemen, shows huge results. In my field, we study game theory. That is strategic interaction. And one of the principles of game theory is there are certain kinds of games where the outcome is likely to be lose-lose and where you can get to an improved situation compared to the outcome. One of these famous games, which some students may have studied, is called the prisoner's dilemma. And you end up in a lose-lose, but you could actually, therefore, have a Pareto improvement, a win-win compared to the status quo. And then we've tested, not we, the economics profession for 50 years. How do you get to that win-win? And you know what the answer is, surprisingly? The simplest way to do it is to let the two players talk with each other. Even if it's not binding, just discussion says, oh yeah, we could get to the win-win, let's do it, okay. And then even though one could cheat on the way, they actually 90% of the time arrive at the win-win together. So this is one of my gripes about Europe and Russia right now. I'm ducking your question again because I know less about it. But when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war, how many times has President Costa, the head of the European Council, met with President Putin? That would be zero. How many times has your High Representative Vice President, Kaja Kallas, met with her counterpart, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov? That would be zero. How can you have peace? How can you expect to reach an agreement if you're not even talking with the other side? You can't. All that happens right now is from Brussels is lightning bolts, anti-Russia, Russophobic lightning bolts. They're going to invade Europe. They're going to destroy Europe. They're going to be in Paris. We need $800 billion of armaments. My advice to you is before you spend $800 billion on armaments, make a phone call first. So I don't know the situation here in detail, and I know there's a lot of pain, and I know there's a lot of history and a lot of angst. Your situation does fulfill one theorem of mine, though, I have to tell you, and that is all problems in the world go back to the British. Okay? That's true in Gaza, that's true in China, that's true in Pakistan, India, that's true throughout the Middle East, that's true here. The British made the biggest mess in this world because they were the most powerful empire for 200 years. And they left behind conflicts everywhere. And they got a lot of nerve as far as I'm concerned. Because even today, Starmer acts like an imperialist. He doesn't have anything to back it up really, although he's got a few nuclear weapons that could destroy the world. But the rest is a bunch of imperial nostalgia, let's say. Grand empire wannabe. But in any event, you fit that mold. All British problems are tough ones also. They were really cynical, and so they tied every place up in knots. You know, the disaster taking place in Palestine right now, one of the reasons is that between 1915 and 1917, the British promised the same territory to 3 different groups. So first, in the McMahon communications, the British promised it to the Arabs. You fight with us against the Turks, it's yours. Then they negotiated the Sykes-Picot Treaty to say to the French, it's yours. Then in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, they said it's a Jewish homeland. This is British. Three times of land that wasn't even theirs. So this is where the problems originate. Now you need to disentangle all of this. But by the way, the history of this island is probably about the most complicated history in the whole world. I'm not kidding you. I don't know of another place where every single empire has been here. From the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, Byzantine, the Umayyads, the Ottomans, the French, the British. And why? Because this island is so beautiful, so strategically located, so productive. Everyone wants it. I want it. You know, that's why I'm here.
Thank you for promoting Cyprus. We love Cyprus. Cyprus it is amazing, actually. I want to summarize to conclude this conversation about the Cyprus problem. From your sayings, also I talked also with Alexander Mercouris. He's another, like you, strategic geopolitics thinker, and he said, you always try in Cyprus to have the European Union, the United States, everyone to help you solve the Cyprus problem, and everyone comes with their agenda. They want not to solve the Cyprus problem, they want to take advantage of you to get something else. So the best thing that you should do, he said to me, is to take your destiny to your own hands. And this is kind of what you are saying as well. Kind of go and talk, force this ourselves to talk. This is your understanding as well, kind of the conclusion?
Yeah, I apologize, and I don't want to oversimplify. Really, I don't. But there should be discussions between Cyprus and Turkey. There should be discussions between Greek part of Cyprus and the Turkish part of Cyprus, as it is right now. There should probably be discussions also with Greece and Turkey and Cyprus, all parts together. There should be discussions right now. The more that, the thing that I don't like, because I don't think it works, to say we need maximum pressure on Turkey right now. I think there should be dialogue right now. There should be analysis. It's not in Turkey's interest to have a divided Cyprus. It isn't. It really isn't at the core. It's
Can
not.
you explain this why? And in your explanation, talk a bit about the Turkey's role inside this geopolitical system of the world.
Look, if there was a Cyprus without the walls, Turkey would be a big beneficiary. There are several 100,000 Turkish Cypriots. They have relations with the Republic of Turkey. Turkey would do a lot of business and a lot of trade It would ease a lot of relations. It would ease a lot of difficulties. Tourism would expand markedly. There would be many, many benefits, issues about the energy system in the Eastern Mediterranean.